and then we'll start with Rockstar, and then Datalink, and then Treello. First, you'll just go over and discuss what you're proposing. Go through that first, and then once everyone's gone, we'll go back to Rockstar first, and then he'll go and start refuting the other arguments and so forth and so forth. Are there any questions?
No.
Okay.
Pretty clear.
I'll basically go off of your arguments. You may be arguing something that is probably incorrect at some point, but that won't matter as long as you argue it the best and give the best points. You could argue that artillery is the best mechanic in this game, and then another person could say, no, it's terrible, but then not argue why it's terrible. You could argue somehow why it's good, and I would have to give points to that person because their argument is better. So just argue well, come up with some points, and you'll get points. So it'll be 1 point each. If there's a tie at the end, then those two will go into a tiebreaker, and I'll just give you some rapid fire questions, which I will judge quickly who has the best answer. So without further ado, Treello. Without further ado, let's get this started. So Rockstar, the first question is, propose a format for the Wargaming League, or defend the current one. So you defend 754 or create a format of your own and argue for that.
All right. So I am a fan of 754. They use a format that's been used in competitive gaming for over the last 15 years, going back all the way to Counter-Strike. It's essentially the same thing. Get to one site, plant bomb, other team has to come defend bomb. You get two separate points to attack. So, one team just can't camp. If they want to put half their tanks one place. Mm-hmm. Oh, you want to go after, you're talking about the tier points. Okay, I thought you were talking. Oh. Okay, that you had me confused there. All right, so if you want to go as far as tier points go, see, I thought about this the wrong way. As far as tier points goes, I think I would still stick with 754, with some slight changes. Until this last buff with the T54 lightweight, you saw a large variety of tanks coming in. Teams weren't going to the default cookie cutters they used to during 742. You had a lot of options with your lineups. This recent patch, you could argue, ruined that. During the grand finals, we saw a lot of YOLO rushes with T54 lightweights. But I think overall, with a slight change to that, I think that's still the most balanced way to go about it. With the tier 8s, you have the lower hit points, and the damage spreads are more even. And so I feel that's a truer display of skill and teamwork, as opposed to going up to, say, tier 10, where a lot of tanks, you can get away with not having good teamwork just because you get some lucky RNG and you get some good bounces and you have a shit ton of HP just to let me rush with.
So you're arguing for the current format tier point wise.
Yes.
Just saying, guys, if either of you also agree or you argue the same thing, you'll both share the point unless you differentiate your argument somehow. So if it's the same argument, then you're arguing the same thing, and I'll give you both points if you win or lose points if you, well, you don't lose points, but you get the idea. So go ahead, Dale.
All right. So honestly, for this question, I feel that perhaps I'm not super informed on it because I've never participated in the league at all, and I've only watched basically this last season. But I will say, purely as a spectator, and my interest in it was not that great because of the T54s lights all over the place. So I feel that at least as is right now, that I would change how it was worked out. I would actually move it to tier 10. This would be more interesting from a spectator side of things, from my observations. Tier 10. I think is the most interesting tier, has the best, in some respects. I mean, obviously, there is the good point about RNG, and certain tanks that are being overpowered, but I think they could perhaps be restricted. And I think that most of the interesting play comes in tier 10. And when I personally play, I like to play at tier 10 the most, and I think it would be most interesting to watch. I would also argue that moving up to that tier, that there should be some restrictions based on class as well. So maybe if you have 7 players, maybe 3 or so tanks per class at most. I think would be perhaps a good restriction to try to come up with potentially the best combination. I think that tier 10 would also allow for the most different combinations of potential tanks and make it the most interesting and the most engaging for the spectator. I can't really argue from the player side because I've never actually played, but at least this last tournament with the current format was a bunch of T54 lights running around, and it just wasn't that interesting to me. So that's what part of the reason I'd argue for tier 10.
Yeah, as spectator, that's fine. That's perfectly fine. Because that's a huge part of it. There's no point if people aren't gonna watch and be entertained. So, okay, Treello, go ahead.
I would actually. So I'm gonna go the opposite end. I'd probably go a 749 max tier 7. I think the tier 7 lights don't have the overpoweredness that that we saw the tier 8s, like the 54 lightweight, just absolutely dominating after patch 9.7. So taking it down to tier 7 would eliminate that. And also, I believe the tier 8 lights are geared for tier 10 matches, so their penetration is, a little bit off. And I think at tier 7, the lights will have a harder time penetrating things like heavy tanks and medium tanks. And so I think we could see that those other classes play a larger role, being able to utilize their armor, being able to utilize hold down. And in tier 7, I don't really feel there is any tank in any one class other than maybe the S51 Arty that is overpowered. So I think a 7-player max tier 7 would be a better format with the new patch.
Okay, so Rockstar's going with 754. Data Link, you're going with tier 10s. Now, you didn't specifically say tier, and I know that might be a little bit more confusing for you because obviously you don't play the league. So, would you just be all 7 players in tier 10s, or would you have any of them drop down? Just to clarify.
Just to clarify, I would probably have probably 7 players and maybe have the points that one would have to be lower, just to make it a little bit of variety.
Okay, because they did propose a format called 768, which was you could have 5 tier 10s and 2 tier 9s, or 6 tier 10s and 1 tier 8.
Yeah, that sounds something.
Okay, so we'll go 768 for you, and then Treello 749. I haven't done the math. I hope it's correct, so I'm not gonna double check that. But okay, so you're going for tier 7. So all right, let's start with Rockstar. Basically, bring up your point and then argue against the other two.
Okay. Well, first off, I'm just gonna address the other two just because those are on my head right now. I don't want to forget them. As far as moving to tier 10, part of the reason that I think these last grand finals were a much larger success than they were in the past. The viewership was up into the hundreds of thousands between the RU and EU streams. That they caught some attention, and I think part of that was because it was no longer such slow gameplay. And while yes, there was the T54 lightweight dirt brushes that kept people excited and on the edge of their seat. When you move up to tier 10, when you have, even with the restrictions that DataLink proposed, you're still going to have, you could still do 3 100s and 3 3s, and you could shut down, say Himmelsdorf real easily. You could just set up in that turtle camp. It doesn't matter what they push through with, how they focus fire. That's so much just raw weight and big hitting guns that, no one's going to want to push into it. It's going to go back to being what it was, and it's going to just be really, really slow gameplay. And while it's in tier 10 and they are the bigger tanks, I just don't feel that would be entertaining to watch, especially the people that don't actually play the format, such as, Treello. As far as the tier 7s, in my opinion, are one of the most unbalanced tiers that there are in the game right now. A whole bunch, I've played in tier 7 skirmishes, and all they turn into is a whole bunch of T29s and Tiger 1s. Yeah, the light tanks aren't as powerful, but between all the other tier classes, the tier 7 mediums are terribly imbalanced between all of them. Looking through, you have, say, the T43, that's garbage. KB13, garbage. All the Arty, obviously, terrible. the WZ-113, the T-34 1, they are just so inferior to the other classes that it would just go back to being just a few set tanks that would dominate compared to everything else. There's just I don't feel that would be any sort of improvement over 754. With a slight, like I said earlier, with a slight nerf to T54 lightweight to get it more in balance with the other light tanks. I think the current format provides a lot of exciting gameplay and gives a lot of options. During the grand finals, for those that watched, there was a lot of little things that I watched that I hadn't seen before. For example, Navi on the first match of the day, they used an MT25 to block for the 1390s, and it's stuff like that where you have a lot of little options and a lot of ways you can get creative. And I feel that, that's going to be most apparent at Tier 8 in the current format.
Okay, Datalink.
All right, yeah. So I think those are actually excellent points, and that's certainly something to consider. But I think that some of what the arguments say against Tier 10 brought up are arguments less to do or things that couldn't necessarily be worked out just in the details. So perhaps better restrictions than what I propose. It's not necessarily, I think, maybe a knock against Tier 10 so much as you don't want 3 3s and 3 E100s. And I think it's also perhaps a knock against map design so much as it is against Tier 10s, that I think you can still make, obviously you put a decent amount of thought into it before you actually implement the change to Tier 10. That's such a, certain restrictions could make it interesting. In terms of evidence against the other formats, I'd agree with Tier 7. I find was probably not that balanced. I mean, you have a great imbalance between, mediums, like said, and great imbalance between tank destroyers. You have the awful Stoyer Mill and on the one end, and 12244 on the other end, for instance. And in terms of Tier 8, I would say, I guess my evidence for against that would be just certainly some interesting things can happen, but it seemed like at least the evidence would be this last tournament was too much of the same thing happening in terms of class of tank. So I guess we're talking about, in terms of the argument against Tier 10, is like a hypothetical, could be bad, whereas my argument is, well, the last tournament was a lot of T54 lights, so the evidence was it actually was not that interesting in that respect, at least. So the hypothetical versus the actual. And so I guess that would be my counter argument there. Yeah, so I guess that's it.
Okay, thanks. Treello?
So, okay. So to rebuttal Rockstar's, this Tier 7 being, imbalanced, and they're going to be those, those tanks that everyone chooses. I mean, that's already what's going on now. You see T32s, you see 5100s, you see IS3s, but, you don't see Navi rolling a Carnarvon or anything like that. I think there are always going to be, no matter what tier that you pick, there are always going to be those tanks that people gravitate towards. In Tier 7, yes, the go-to heavy is probably going to be the T29 for its hull down. But I believe the T29 is a much more vulnerable target at Tier 7 than a T32 is at Tier 8. I also like the idea of not having auto-loading heavies and or mediums at Tier 7. I think removing the auto-loaders would be a little bit more exciting. It's kind of boring when an auto-loader rolls in and just unloads a clip and there goes someone. As far as Tier 10 goes, I'll have to agree with Rock in that, without restrictions, we've talked about a little bit of restrictions, but nothing's nailed down, so we've got to assume, what we can. The hit point variance is so large within Tier 10. A mouse has 3,000 hit points. if you're going to unbalance the hit point pool that much, there's only so much, people can do without having to chew through a massive amount of hit points. And I believe at tier 7, you're able to maintain the hit point pools relatively equal no matter what tanks you choose. Whereas at tier 10, you can choose tanks that will completely imbalance the hit point pool. And yeah, that's pretty much it for me.
Okay, so you've all sort of refuted each other's arguments and gone through. So basically, I'll go through and I'll bring up points of interest in each of your arguments and have you sort of talk about them. So Rockstar with tier 8, the other guys bring up a good point too, where it's difficult to argue against too selective of a map or tank choices. When in tier 8, obviously there are pretty dominant, easy choices every time. We don't see a great deal of variation. So that's difficult to argue, but with tier 8, do you think that it is sort of the same old story with each of the tanks, and do you think that it would be better or worse for the others, or do you think that your tier is still a tier that basically, when we look at the others, whether they were implemented or not, you would still have the most consistent tanks? So, for example, you would have the largest pool of tanks still being selected versus a tier 10 or tier 7.
Yeah, well, you just pointed out the exact thing I was going to point out. I feel at tier 8, you're going to get the widest variety. Once again, it's just the one bad apple right now with the T54 lightweight being overbuffed. If you tweak that a little bit, maybe take away the APCR, give it some heat so it has the same issues that the 1390s and RUs have to deal with, you go back to having the larger variety. Before that 54 lightweight buff, just during the last North American season or the last EU season, we saw a pretty large variety of tanks, like was said earlier, 5100, the IS-3, the T-32, but then you also have your Pershings, your 69s, 1390s, RUs, T-54 lightweights, and there was a lot of other tanks that got used, including, with the 6s and 7s. There was a whole large variety of the different tanks that showed up. You got the T-37s, the 5916s, the 12Ts. They all have their little niche that they can fulfill, and it, having those options let teams play around. And once again, go back to the Navi example, they brought an MT-25, which one also brought just for the one thing. And, having that pool there where they could, pick something that worked like that. And, that was up to them to figure out what would work. And that gave them, they had all those tanks to play with. I think just based on that, you're going to get a larger map pool than at 7s or 10s. With the 7s, you get the T-29 and the Tiger. Outside of that, that you can't really argue that many of their tanks are going to be used except for their tier 7 lights. So unless you want to put a restriction on that, all of a sudden you're going to have the Bulldogs and the T-71s coming in everywhere because they're the only autoloader tanks at that tier, and they're going to, be pretty dominant. And then just one counterpoint I wanted to throw in real quick. As far as the autoloaders go, I personally think the autoloader takes take more skill than make it boring. With clip coordination, what balance of autoloaders versus consistent fire do you want to bring? I think it's really impressive to watch teams that can bring a high amount of autoloaders and actually be able to win with their coordination. All it takes is a couple missed shots and not being able to clip out a tank, and all of a sudden that IS-3, T-32, whatever it is going to chase down whatever that 50 is and clip them out. So that's about it.
Okay, yeah. So Data Link, you're arguing for a tier 10 format with probably a 9s or 8s. Now, I don't necessarily believe that tier 10 wouldn't work just because of the large hit point pool, because especially on E100s and things like that, which were mentioned, because I played a tournament with that and it was fine. But my question to you is, will tier 10s disengage an audience too much where not everyone has a tier 10? Do you think that would be a negative against your format in terms of tier 8 is more accessible, or even tier 7 more accessible than a tier 10, which are difficult to get? Not so many people can relate to that tier as much. Do you think that would be something that would go against your format, or do you still believe that your format would be far more entertaining to watch because they're tier 10?
I think that it's certainly a interesting point, and I had actually considered that as I was considering this question. And I ultimately came to the conclusion that it'll probably turn some people off, but not to such an extent that it would invalidate the idea. And what I mean by that is that tier 10s are kind of the ultimate goal for everybody. Even when they start the game, they look at the tree and they see a tier 10 at the end and they want to get to that tier 10. And so I think that this will keep it engaging in a certain kind of sense that even if you don't have a tier 10 and maybe you're still like 6 months at the rate that you play away from getting a tier 10, I think you'll still want to see how they play and be interested in seeing them played and be interested in seeing them played at a high level of skill, which is what the format will also allow. Ultimately, I think that this plays into my idea that tier 10s are the most interesting tier that you know most of us want to play at, particularly once we get there. And this itself would make it more engaging, and then also just seeing them played at a high level of skill would be a great experience, I think. So that's why I continued to have this idea of tier 10s, even after considering that objection.
Okay. And Treello, for tier 7, it would be a great tier in terms of accessibility. Lots of people can get to tier 7. It's really not that difficult. My worry for tier 7 would be that what others have brought up in terms of the tank selection. I think there are some tanks in tier 7 that are particularly very powerful. Do you think that we would see, like, for light tanks, we basically just see bulldogs? I mean, I couldn't even envision AMX 1375s really. I mean, it's just bulldogs, or your T29s Tiger, or maybe IS as well, I suppose. Do you think that there would be a less expansive tank selection at tier 7, or do you think that it could really work in terms of there could be more viability and more theory crafting that could go into tier 7 that would make it a very, very valid tier to play at?
Absolutely. And I think what we've seen over the WGL, like just over its entire lifetime, is teams bringing tanks to the table that no one thought were viable league tanks. I can't remember what team it was, but when they brought in the IS-6, everyone was kind of like, huh? Why on earth would you bring an IS-6? And they absolutely dominated with it. Um, and I think we could see some of the same things come out of Tier 7. I think a lot of people look at Tier 7 as, kinds of that transition from noob to high level play. Tier 8 and up is considered, a much different game than Tier 7 and below. And so I think tier 7 play could show players how to transition into a higher level of play with those tanks that they do have available. The experience gap between 7 and 8 is quite considerable. And so there's a lot of molding that happens at tier 7. And so watching people play those tiers could revitalize people into being like, oh, okay, yeah, I can do this. This is what my tank is capable of. And I do think we could see some pretty crazy things with what some of these innovative teams have done with other tanks, such as the IS-6 and whatnot.
Okay, so I gotta make a call here, and it's pretty close. Just out of curiosity, do you guys know what I would have picked?
Well, your personal biases, you would have gone to tier 10 from what I
Actually, no, I would have gone tier 9, but this is tough. Well, I mean, you all have good arguments, and it's
Artillery sucks.
Wow. Okay, so Data Link, I really thought your argument was great. Yeah, no, I think you all did really well. And Data Link, I think you did fantastically, considering you don't actually play in the league. And but to be fair, a spectator's opinion is a valid, important opinion, because if it's not watchable, there's there's nothing in it. Whether the players like playing it or not, if it's not enjoyable to watch. But generally, they go hand in hand anyway. I personally did enjoy the Tier 10 tournament I played, but whether it would work after the meta evolves is very difficult to understand. I do think just by a knife's edge, Rockstar did slightly edge it in his argument with the tier 8s. And that's probably because he has that background to sort of help him argue it. But Datalink, you were very close at points, and in Treello as well. I think you got very close, and especially because Tier 7 will be very engaging with the audience in terms of it's so accessible to get to Tier 7. Even Tier 8, sometimes people struggle to get to. The XP gap you need to research just jumps. So congratulations to Rockstar. You're 1 point up. We got a couple more questions. So this time we'll start with Datalink, and then we'll go to Treello, and then we'll go back to Rockstar. So we'll just move down like that for the subsequent questions. So let me quickly set that up, and then Datalink, I'll let you know.
All right.
Okay, so the next question is, what is the most balanced tier in class above tier 7? So we're basically going to look at a tier. So you're going to pick a tier, and then you're going to be a specific tank class and just argue that that tank class has the most balance in it. There's no real overpowered or underpowered tanks. So just general stuff like that. And then the other guys will also give their opinions, and then you'll argue, say like, well, actually, I think in your tier, in your class, so example, tier 7, I have an example, tier 7 mediums, I think this tank is underpowered and ridiculous, and this tank is overpowered in that tier, or something like that. So go right ahead, Data.
All right, so to start off, I say I don't think you can entirely avoid the no underpowered or overpowered for this answer, but I'm going to go with no ridiculously overpowered or underpowered in the spirit of, I think, the intention of the question was asked. And while there are certainly variations in the viability or power within this tier, and it's something that cannot be avoided, I'm going to have to give it to tier 10 mediums. Every tier 10 medium, I think, is going to be effective and have an impact on the game, at least in the hands of a semi-competent player. And, certainly rate some of them near the bottom, like maybe the M48, and then perhaps the STB1 would be at the very top. But I think that neither of those are going to be completely, say, ridiculously overpowered or ridiculously underpowered, in that they can't have or have a very difficult time in having impact in the game. And so I think that there's balance there. Also, mediums as a class tend to have the best ability to do well despite the map or in spite of whatever map is chosen. And I think this is actually something that factors in to the idea of what balance is. Whereas some classes of tanks are maybe very dependent upon the map in order to do well. Certainly tank destroyers, which are very slow and, like restricted fields of fire, don't like to be flanked, are going to do very well on some maps and struggle on others. And I think mediums are best able to adapt. So there's an argument for mediums in general. And then tier 10 mediums, I think, have the least variance between the mediums themselves. So I guess that there's kind of two arguments there. One is that mediums are best are as a class are best able to adapt. And then the reason I choose tier 10 specifically is that I think the tier 10 mediums themselves are closer in balance than, say, the other tiers of mediums. Less variation in tank ability and more ability to carry in a game than perhaps the other classes.
Oh, good strong argument. Treello.
I'm going to pick, as far as classes go, mediums as well. I believe mediums in general overall are probably within a class the most balanced in the entire game. But I'll probably select tier 8 instead. I believe the tier 8 mediums, and I'm going to use data links, none of them are so underpowered or overpowered that they are absolutely not viable. The T44 probably would be your equivalent M48. It's not the best medium at tier, but at the same time, if it's facing tier 10s and everything like that, it still has some viability. It's not just a rock on the battlefield. We have something there. And the the other one, unfortunately, I haven't played the STA one. I don't know how that plays really. I've never I've never had a problem battling against it. But I've platooned with a few of them, and they always seem to be able to hit their shots very well. And unfortunately, that's the only medium at tier 8 I'm unfamiliar with, so I wouldn't be able to make an argument for that particular one. But I believe the tier 8 mediums are probably the most balanced.
Alrighty, Rockstar. What do you think?
All right, so I largely agree with what Datalink said as far as there's, every tier has their the odd tanks out. And originally thinking about this question, I was going to do the same argument Datalink picks as far as tier 10 mediums. But looking at it a little bit more, and looking at, a lot of other competitions and other stuff where, during competitions, you really see which tanks are the most powerful, not powerful, which work, whatnot. I'm going to argue for tier 8 heavies. I feel that there's the most variety there. If you go back to the WGLNA, you see almost all of the tier 8 heavies used at one time or another in different things, with the only oddball being the British heavy, the Carnivron. And that's just because it's kind of a turd. Other than that, though, I mean, if you look through the tier 8 heavies, you got a T-32 from the Americans, you got the Tiger 2 from the Germans. French have the 5100, obviously the autoloader, which you could argue is slightly overpowered. No, I'll give you that. But I think, you miss one shot on that clip versus a tier 8 heavy, and all of a sudden you're done. And if that heavy's smart and stays on you, and, it's one-on-one, you can still come on top of that. IS3, KV4, I think for what they do, especially in pub matches, both very balanced. And then the 110. I feel that all of those tanks can be played to their strengths well, one-on-one versus each other. And I think that's where you're going to have the least discrepancy if you look at it as far as one-on-ones. You go up to tier 10 mediums, you have, a 140 is going to kick everything's ass pretty much just based on DPM and having the best bounceability. The only tank that could possibly take it on is a Bat Chat. Other than that, 140 one-on-one is going to destroy a Leopard. It's going to destroy a STB. And I feel that there's not enough variety or volatility out of the other tier 10s.
Ooh, okay, some good arguments. Alright, so let's go back to Datalink. Shut down the other two.
What I'd like to argue is that so against tier 8 mediums, one of the things I guess this could be general argument against just tier 8 in general, if we're talking about balance, is something else that anything other than tier 10 has to contend with if you're talking about balance is matchmaking. And tier 8s are going to vary wildly in ability dependent upon the matchmaking, if they're bottom tier or if they're top tier. And tier 10s don't have to be balanced in any kind of sense against anything. They're always going to be tier 10. They're always going to be top tier. So I think this factors into the balance a little bit. Now, in terms of tier 8 mediums, I think this was actually probably the second conclusion I would have chosen. So I think it's somewhat of a solid choice. I would say, though, that the variance in ability between some of the tanks is a bit more. I would think like the 416 in the hands of a competent player, if they're spamming heat, it's got the T54 gun, is a very, very, very good tank, close to overpowered. And so I would say maybe it fails the intent of the question there. And and also it's tier 8, which is, goes for my argument for just tier 10 being just better balanced as a tier. And then for the tier 8 heavies, I do love my tier 8 heavies, but, when he admitted that the Carnarvon is somewhat of a turd, then it seems like when you're asking nothing underpowered as part of the question, then it seems like it just has not met the intent of the question at that point. And that perhaps even the 5100 is overpowered, so I think that the length or the change between the bottom and the top in terms of the power structure of that tier at tier 8 heavies is even greater than the tier 8 mediums, and doesn't meet the intent as much as the tier 10s in my mind.
Okay, Treello, shut the other two down.
So I'll address the tier 8 heavies first, because I agree with Datalink on that. When you look at the British heavy, it's a turd, and it is underpowered for tier. It does have the Royal Ordnance gun, but that's really, I mean, if it has anything going for it, it's that. But it has no speed, it has no armor, and it's a turd of a tank. If we're in, Datalink mentioned, the 416 could borderline overpowered in the tier 8 mediums, as far as, slinging gold. If we're taking premium rounds into account, the KV4, in my opinion, is just not going to be that great of a tank either, because it relies purely on its stature, and if you're slinging gold at it, it has nothing else for it. It is supposed to be a brick shit house, and it's just not when it has gold slinging at it. Um, and then to address tier 10 mediums, I unfortunately didn't have enough time to prepare, but when he was talking about it, I was looking over them, and that I probably would have picked that also until I got to the bat chat. The bat chat's clip capability, it can clip an entire tier 10 medium. The 140 will be able to do some damage to it, but if a bat chat gets the drop on a 140, I believe, the bat chat will destroy the 140. And opposite of that, I think if the 140 got the drop on the bat chat will still be able to clip him full health. The tier 8 mediums do have an autoloader. They have the T69, but the T69 does not really have the ability to clip an entire other tank. And it's also using, heat as its premium round, AP as its normal. And we know tier 10 mediums always get APCR for their premium, and the ability of a T69 to just dominate another medium like a bat chat can just isn't there.
Rockstar?
Okay, so a couple points I want to go over. One, as far as that at least matchmaker argument, every tank in the game has to deal with that to where it's going to struggle for mad matchmaker. You could even argue that for a tier 10 medium. You get a 140 on Himmelsdorf with a whole other team of nothing but heavy tanks. That 140 is really going to struggle to do anything. You could argue that, yes, this tier 8's, tier 8, you get some bad matchmaker, you get some bottom tier stuff, but they're still workable. T32 will bounce tier 10 shells from the turret all day long. Even the KV4, if properly angled and played, in the hands of someone capable, can certainly hold its own for a while. Obviously, if it gets pushed by a bunch of tier 10 heavies or something, it's not going to last. But no tank will. Not even a mouse. Might last longer, but it's not going to, do any better. So, and as far as the Carnivoron point, yeah, Carnivoron's a turd. But every tier has those tanks that are just completely awful. If you want to look tier 10 mediums, just like Datalink pointed out, the M48, M46, those are tanks that are just. Why do you even want to play them? They will never be picked in Clan Wars. Not if anybody.
Don't insult my M46, and that's tier 9, so.
Well, M48, and then the M60 is what I meant.
Oh, well, okay, yeah.
So those are going to be those are never going to be picked for anything important because they're just so unbalanced. If you can, why bring an M48 when you can bring a 140, even a 121 to an extent. But I just don't feel that that discrepancy between those tier 10 mediums is any bigger than the discrepancy between the one oddball of the tier 8 heavies. And as far as the KV4 is very workable even when it's bottom tier. Yes, gold will cause you some issues, but if played properly, that front plate will bounce, tier 10 gold shells. You just have to be playing smart and paying attention to all your angles. But you could say that about a lot of the other tier 8 heavies. T32 can work in a tier 10 match. The 110 can troll the shit out of tier 10 heavies, excuse the language. But I feel that the drop off between the best and the worst is the smallest between that as opposed to the tier 8 mediums or the tier 8 or tier 10 mediums. And as far as the tier 8 mediums go, yes, you have, the T44 is the oddball there, but I think that the tier 8 mediums have the greatest discrepancy between them. You got the Chinese one, the T34-1, that tank's complete and utter trash. The STA is fun in pub matches. It has a good gun, but as far as brawling with the other ones, it just doesn't have anything that can work. It's big, it's clunky, it has the tumor, and the gun doesn't have any sort of great penetration. It has a good rate of fire, but it doesn't matter if you're going to be bouncing all your shots. 416, on the other hand, like was pointed out, you play that tank smart, you sit back, you find some bushes, you use the absurd camo rating it has, and that thing can, just completely dominate the other ones. And then you go look at the Centurion. That's another turd at tier 8 medium. It's not particularly fast. Gun's kind of meh. Turret's penable at everything, so you can't really hold down. And I just feel that tier 8 mediums just have the most holes in them as far as being unbalanced within the tier.
Okay, so you've all basically gone over and just talked about why yours is better than the others. So I'll go through and I'll try and pick holes in your arguments. Basically, you go and quickly defend your class. So we'll start with Data Link, obviously, with the tier 10 mediums. Could it not be said that the tier 10 mediums, in a sense, you've got, the gap between the very best of them and the very worst is too big. Someone brought it up, that with the Batchat being able to actually fully clip one of its own tiers, without, having to reload and come back and finish the job, assuming it lands all its shots. You have the Russian mediums, which are very, very strong. Are these tanks too good compared to such tanks like maybe the 121 or the M48 or the Leo one? So yeah.
You mean the Amarak one? But yeah, so I think that there certainly is a gulf between the two, or the top and the bottom in terms of the the Batchat perhaps at the top, or the STB-1. I would say one of those two are probably at the top, and then the 121 and M48 are at the bottom. Certainly there's a gulf between there. I'm not going to deny that, but I think that's within any tier, and I think that within tier 10 it's going to be the least. In part because being tier 10, they're not going to be as heavily overmatched. So I think the matchmaking argument is still relevant. And number two, even the worst of the tier 10 mediums still have decent carry capability and competent hands. They still have the ability to make an impact on the game, and certainly any tank can have an impact on the game, but they can have a consistent impact on the game played well. Whereas certain other tanks at other tiers, such as maybe say the Carnarvon, just have struggled to even have an impact. And I would say that, so certainly there's a gap. I'm not going to deny that there's a gap, but I think the gap is less at tier 10, in part because matchmaking is important, and in part because even the worst of the tier 10s still can have a positive impact on the game, particularly when played correctly.
Okay. Treello, with the tier 8 mediums, I just feel that I could pick out three of them: the T69, the Object 416, the Pershing, and be like, these are clearly vastly superior to the other ones. You have, the T20s, or not T20. I'm sorry, I went to the wrong tier there. The Panther 2 is not so awesome. The T44 is okay, but gets Amarak every time it gets shot, and so is the gulf bigger in your tier, or less? Is the gulf less? Well, I don't even know how to word that now because I've messed myself up so bad. But the point is basically, is the gulf larger, with tier 10 mediums than say your mediums, or with the the best of the tier 8 heavies as well, being, you know, too far ahead of the other tier 8 heavies. Is your tier where the gulf is the smallest?
As far as comparative to the tier 8 heavies, it's definitely smaller than the tier 8 heavies. I believe the difference between a Carnarvon and a T-32 is immeasurable. I've unfortunately had to play that tank lately, and it's just, I don't think it can get any work done at tier 10. So I believe, I don't believe there is a tier 8 medium that can't get any work done at tier 10. But I do believe the Carnarvon is one of those heavies that can't get anything done. I've never played the VK 4502A, but to be honest, I've never been afraid of one either. So I'm not sure if that's that great of a tank. As far as the gap between best and worst in tier 8 compared to the best and worst of tier 10, my experience isn't that great in tier 10 with the mediums.